The Honourable Member for Rustico Emerald and the Opposition Whip.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Mr. Speaker, in the new NAFTA, or the USMCA, Canada gave the American dairy industry access to almost 4% of the Canadian market. To put this in perspective, this is equivalent to 100% of the milk produced by Nova Scotia's 215 dairy farms, plus all of Prince Edward Island's 165 dairy farms. It is my understanding that the Dairy Farmers of PEI Board has met with the Premier to express their grave concerns with this new trade agreement. So a question for the Premier. Have you taken those concerns and addressed them with the Prime Minister?
Honourable Premier.
Mr. Speaker, the Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries and I did indeed meet with the dairy farmers of PEI and a group of, I would say, 10 good farmers and board members of the dairy farmers, and they were quite clear in presenting their concerns, and we were very clear in acknowledging that those are real concerns and that we want to work with the dairy farmers, PEI, in every way we can, including measures that will come forward through the federal government, and we are working on that. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Premier. The Honourable Member, Rustico Emerald.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker, and hopefully the Minister of Agriculture has had a chance to meet with the board as well. Agriculture in rural PEI forms the base of our island economy. The 165 island family-owned dairy farms are critical to our island's economic base, and the ripple effect into our economy is huge. The milk produced by island dairy farmers feed businesses large and small, from ADL to Cow's Creamery to Purity Dairy to even to Glasgow Glen Farms. So a question for the Minister of Agriculture. What are you doing to ensure that we don't lose family-owned dairy farms, destabilizing our island's economic base?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries.
Mr. Speaker, very good question. Obviously, as Minister of Agriculture, we value the dairy farmers in Prince Edward Island. There are approximately 165 dairy entities in Prince Edward Island, and we have programs, just like the program I just recently mentioned there, the PEI Clean Technology program that is out there. But I think the bigger question here is making sure that we're able to adapt to the particular changes as the USMCA gets signed. We have not seen actually a final text of that agreement at this point, but I think it's really important that farmers, it looks like there will be transition funding that will be available, and my role will be to make sure that we get our fair share for Prince Edward Island dairy farmers to access those funds, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. The Honourable Member for Rustico Emerald.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. Indeed, Minister, that is one of the big roles you will have, is to make sure that any funding from Ottawa does make it to the farmers, and it makes sure that these family-owned farms do not go under. And so, question for the Minister of Agriculture. What conversations have you had so far with the federal government to make sure that you take a proactive approach to that role?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries.
Mr. Speaker, as the Honourable Premier mentioned earlier, I did have the opportunity to meet with the dairy farmers of PEI, and I've also had the opportunity to meet with ADL, and just recently the Minister of Economic Development and I and the Minister of Workforce Advanced Learning had a tour of the recent expansion at the ADL plant in Summerside. I think there's two components of this that are really important to note. One is to make sure that in Prince Edward Island our processors get access to what's called TRQs. It's the tariff rate quotas. And under the previous agreement under CETA and under TPP, I believe was negotiated under a previous federal government, PEI did not get its fair share of TRQs, and the other is making sure if there's transition funds that we get our fair share for our producers and for our processors, Mr. Speaker.
The Honourable Member for Rustico Emerald.
Well, thank you, Mr. Speaker. So it's my understanding that today the Dairy Farmers of Canada issued a statement to the federal government. To prevent further damage to the Canadian dairy sector, they are asking that the federal government do not sign the USMCA until U.S. oversight of the Canadian dairy system has been removed from the agreement. They say it's a matter of Canadian sovereignty. So this is a question to the Minister of Agriculture. Do you stand with island dairy farmers and support them in this request?
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries.
Mr. Speaker, obviously as Minister of Agriculture and PEI, I want to make sure that our dairy farmers are supported in every way. When it comes to trade deals, these are negotiated with the federal government, with other particular countries, and we've now seen 3 major trade deals happen in Canada here with the CPTPP, the CETA, and now the USMCA. I think it's very important that our supply management system will stay intact, and in this particular case, it will stay intact. They did lose some market access that will have to be shared by some of these other jurisdictions. But I think it's really important to note when we were at ADL, there's some great partnerships that have occurred. I know there's a company in Denmark that's partnered with our ADL corporation here, and they are looking at providing real good quality dairy products to consumers here in Canada, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. The Honourable Member for Rustico Emerald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So the Dairy Board has been very proactive, and in light of the new USMCA, there's been a flood of posts about how to buy local dairy products, how to identify them. And as a result, companies like ADL have seen local sales spike, even running out of some products. So islanders want to buy local and support their friends, neighbours, and the island economy. But one of the big problems with buying local on the island here is often it's hard to identify, locally produced products. We've seen it with dairy, and we've seen it in other areas as well. A question to the Minister of Agriculture. What are you doing to make sure islanders can identify island produce and buy locally?
Every islander will be
The Honourable Minister of Agriculture and Fisheries.
Mr. Speaker, that is one situation that has been very fortunate about all this discussion around trade deals and their impacts it might have on our dairy farmers. And islanders have been very supportive of our island dairy industry, and they are actually seeing great increases in our market access here, Mr. Speaker. In fact, the dairy industry in Prince Edward Island has been growing at over 3% annually over the last number of years. And in fact, in Canada, the dairy industry has been growing at about 2%. Remember, this trade deal we're talking about is 3.6% over 6 years of market access. So the dairy industry in Canada is growing faster than what the amount of trade that will be access that will be granted to other countries, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. The Honourable Member for Rustico Emerald.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. So once again, the provincial protein tender issued this fall by Health PEI specifically gives preference to off-island brands. It's right in the tender, in the spreadsheet, like Maple Leaf, J.M. Schneider, Allamal, well, especially for value-added products. So this is something, Mr. Speaker, I've been lobbying to change for years now. But it seems that the requests that I've made on behalf of islanders, island farmers in particular, are falling on deaf ears, Mr. Speaker. So question to the Minister of Finance. When it comes to government food tenders, why are you not sourcing local island food?
The Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I think we've proven that we're sourcing island food, Mr. Speaker. There are specifics around procurement that we have to deal with, Mr. Speaker, and it's in regards to back to the NAFTA negotiations, Mr. Speaker. Ron Ambrose, who's supposed to be here today, Mr. Speaker, was part of
Very supportive of the deal, I'm told.
was very supportive of the NAFTA deal and an advisor to the Trudeau government, and we acknowledge that and commend her for that effort. Mr. Speaker, we've also visited the schools, most recently the educational schools, and we're dealing with providing local products to schools. So we're starting programs in that regard to deal with local products, Mr. Speaker. So, Mr. Speaker, we're doing everything we can to provide access to our local markets, to islanders, and reduce our trade imbalance. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you, Minister. The Honourable Member for Rustico Emerald, your final question.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, this is simple common sense. Why not use taxpayers' money to fill the food tenders that the island government needs to purchase? It's very simple, very common sense. And the minister really didn't answer my question. I'd asked, why are you not sourcing local island food? So I'm going to ask the minister if he's confident that there is some source of island food going on. I would ask the minister if he will table across government departments the percentage of food tenders that are filled with local island produce. Will you do that?
Honorable Minister of Finance.
I think part of that question, Mr. Speaker, should be, can we table those initiatives based on who applied for those tenders, Mr. Speaker, may be easier. But we could certainly take a look at that, Mr. Speaker. I have no problem whatsoever, Mr. Speaker. We're the first ones in government to stand up and say we can go and access local food and product here on Prince Edward Island to help out local. I continuously tweeting out buy local, Mr. Speaker. I was doing it last week with a minor hockey team that were buying local produce, selling local produce. Mr. Speaker, this member needs to understand there is procurement rules from province to province and within Canada. We're under the Canadian Free Trade Agreement, Mr. Speaker. We have to continue to...
It's not an issue.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Okay.